thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you this evening. Australia has, since its birth, been a dependent nation. Even on federation, if Australians thought they were then going to be independent or have a foreign policy and a defence policy of their own, they weren't. We didn't have a foreign affairs department of any note till Dr. Everett established it after the Second World War. We believed that if we supplied men, money, spent Australian blood and resources in fighting the empire wars, the empire would defend us should we ever need it. The only trouble was we kept that policy going long past its use-by date. Menzies and Latham were reluctant, refused to sign the Statute of Westminster because they both believed it would reduce Britain's obligation to defend us. It was in fact signed in 1942 and had to be backdated, otherwise some wartime acts of the government would have been quite illegal. Well, Britain, of course, probably after the Second World War, the First World War, had no capacity to defend us. It wasn't recognised how much she'd been weakened in the First War, and the fact that she no longer had a two-ocean navy. And if there was going to be problems in Europe, the navy was going to be in the Atlantic and the British theatre, and not in the Pacific. And that should have been recognised. It wasn't recognised. Now, after the war, ANZUS was actually signed more as a protection against a resurgent Japan than anything else, but it turned into a believed protection against the expansion of Soviet communism. And I supported the alliance strongly while the Soviet Union existed, but after 1990, after the collapse and breakup of the Soviet Union, we have not recognized that the world has changed very substantially. The book's called Dangerous Allies. I actually think the people who are dangerous in Australia are the ones who refuse to recognize that the strategic context in which we live and must work out our own future has changed dramatically and is probably now more sensitively balanced than any time since the end of the Second World War itself. The United States has changed very significantly from the first President Bush, who made one of the best speeches after the first Gulf War about the kind of America he wanted to see, a speech which I think everyone would applaud. But then the neoconservatives and their policy, the ideas of American exceptionalism gained much greater credence and much greater effect on policy. And then there was the second Iraq War. Now, Wolfowitz was heard at one point saying, well, you know, we believe that if we get rid of Saddam Hussein, a benign democracy will arise and be so powerful that it will spread throughout the Middle East. And that was the belief of the neoconservatives, and how people who probably got double first at some university could be so damn stupid, I don't understand. But of course they said, you won't get worldwide support for that. But they got Britain and they got Australia to support war because the Americans said there were weapons of mass destruction, which I believe were known to be a lie at the time. And if anyone doubted it, it was certainly proved to be a lie at a later point. But after 1990, when I believe Australia might exercise a greater degree of independence, we have step by step, without any reference to Australia, become more closely bound to the United States than ever before. And most of this has happened without reference to Australia, without the matter being raised at any election, and just one step after another have been announced. Now, there have been many things. Major General Burr, an active serving Australian Major General, the second in charge of 60,000 American troops in the Western Pacific. I read it in The Guardian. It was announced by the United States Secretary of State for War. It was not announced in Australia. There was no announcement from the Australian Defence Department. We have a frigate, part of USS Washington's escort service for about 4 months a year. So sailing up and down within sight of the Chinese mainland with that aircraft carrier, and probably being slightly provocative to China itself. If China had an equivalent aircraft carrier and sailed up and down off the Norfolk naval base in the east coast of America, I think America would get paranoid with fury, with frenzy, and with probably some sort of fear also. I suppose I started to write the book when I found Julie Gillard announcing a task force was going to be established at Darwin. Because this wasn't a getting to know you exercise, it's not becoming friends, it's a powerful three-service task force which can deploy power anywhere in the Western Pacific. And no American president is going to say to our Prime Minister, look, we want to use this to do something or other and attack somebody. The Prime Minister will probably read about it in the newspaper, and probably in the Australian. Now, it wouldn't be very difficult, perhaps, to get rid of that task force and tell the Americans it had to go somewhere else. They'd be displeased, obviously. But what's happened to Pine Gap is a different matter. Over the last 20 or 25 years, modern weapons technology has turned Pine Gap from a almost purely defensive facility, very useful certainly, Russian missiles taking off, where are they going, how far are they going, are they being accurate or not, would have given early warning of any attack. But now, Pine Gap is also an offensive, has a major offensive role in the firing of a variety of modern weapon systems, including drones. The Pine Gap was almost certainly involved in targeting Australians in the Yemen. We don't seem to mind. They were in bad company. They were obviously bad people. Well, Americans mind when President Obama kills Americans in the Yemen. And he's been forced to publish the legal advice that he got from the legal department in the States, justifying and indicating that he had power to kill Americans aboard. Well, it's not, I've read the document. I wouldn't want to take it into any court in Australia and try and win the case, because you wouldn't. Now, if it was only America and China, I believe that the two of them left together could probably avoid a conflict, avoid war. But it's not only America and China. It's also Japan, newly aggressive, newly militarist, a thoroughly assertive Prime Minister, a Prime Minister who's torn up perhaps the most important part of their constitution. He wanted to get a constitutional change to enable Japan to be a normal power in terms of the use of its armed forces. But then he found the Poles were going to say, no, you'll never win it. So this is all right, we'll reinterpret it. Well, if you reinterpret that part of the Constitution, there is no part that he cannot reinterpret. And he's got away with that. The New York Times has written that those islands in the East China Sea more properly belong to China than to Japan. But Japan says there's no dispute. President Obama, a couple of months ago, extended the American nuclear guarantee to cover those islands. Now, Hugh White and others have said that a dispute could easily occur over the East China Sea, and it could be a conflict, and if a conflict starts, where will it end? Because of Obama's commitment, if there is a conflict between China and Japan, America is automatically involved. And you mightn't like it, and so is Australia. Our Prime Minister technically can get on his feet and say, we're not going to be involved, we'll pass this one by, as the Canadians passed by Iraq, as the Canadians passed by Vietnam. But with those troops in Darwin, with the uses of Pine Gap, There is nobody outside of Australia who would believe an Australian Prime Minister who said we were not involved. So as a result of the last 25 years, as a result of the actions of successive governments involving both the major parties, America now has the capacity to take us to war, and in my view, that is a step too far. That's a power that Britain once had in the days of empire, but it's not a power that now should be delegated or abdicated to any other nation, whatever we may think of that nation, and especially in America, that has exhibited such a total incapacity to undertake sensible, constructive diplomacy. It's made a total mess of the Middle East, and probably a total mess of the Crimea also, and now they want to turn their attention to the Pacific. And the first thing President Obama does is extend that nuclear guarantee to Japan, to encourage Japan to be more assertive and more aggressive in relation to China, which could make it more likely that there's a conflict between those two. And so the bottom line of the book, it's a simple one. I don't believe Australia should cede to any other country the power to take us to war. That should be a decision of the Australian Parliament, or if you like, of the Australian people. I don't even agree with current practice where it's a decision of one man, because the Cabinet's not going to deny their Prime Minister in these circumstances, and I'd sooner trust the collective judgment of the Parliament than I would of a Prime Minister. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Should be on. You can hear me.
Tin needs, I'm sorry, not very good upstairs.
Well, welcome, all of you, and Malcolm, you can certainly still fill a room. You explained to us your motivation for writing this book. It's a thought-provoking book. I've delved into it in the past few days. Some of the ideas are a bit confronting. Some here might regard them as problematical. You're encouraged to think of questions to ask Malcolm in the next stage of this process, and challenging questions. Some of you will have them, I'm sure. My task is to engage Malcolm in a conversation and try and tease out some of these ideas that he's presented in this very thought-provoking book, which has captured a lot of attention. I should mention this is the second time in 39 years that I have asked Malcolm Fraser a question in public. Do your maths. The last time Chatham House Rules, Malcolm, didn't cover the question that I asked, and in fact I think much of the country was listening to that question and others that were asked on that day. And of course, back then I would never have presumed to refer to Mr. Fraser as Malcolm, but he's given me special dispensation. It's hard for someone who's a young reporter back then in the Parliamentary Press Gallery to get used to calling you by your first name. But we're grateful to you for coming here today and talking to us and sharing your provocative views. And I wonder if I could start, Malcolm, by asking you a question that really builds on what you had just said about your motivation for writing the book. It was after Julia Gillard acceded to the American request to allow a US Marine task force to transition through Darwin. I just wonder if I can put the question this way. If you had...
It's not quite the right word. I mean, in American Washington jargon now, passing through equals base. It's an American base, and we shouldn't...
Yeah, no, look, I think that's a fair point. To have base facilities in Darwin as part of a general program of interoperability, as I think they call it these days in a defence sense. I just wonder, if you were Prime Minister at that time and a request had come from an American president for that sort of level of engagement, what your response might have been?
In the post-Cold War era you're talking about?
Yes, I'm talking about in the context of the agreement that was struck by Julia Gillard.
If I was Prime Minister, I would ask the Americans to remove their troops, and I'd give them 6 months to do so. Much more important, I would say that within 3 months I'm going to take every Australian out of Pine Gap. We try and kid ourselves that it's an Australian base, but it's controlled and commanded by an American. And the only way we can demonstrate to the world that we are not directly complicit in the targeting of modern American weapon systems is by taking our people out of the base itself and say the Americans can fill it themselves with their own people until we give them, what, 4 or 5 years, because it wouldn't be a substantial task to rebuild those facilities somewhere else. And so I'm perfectly prepared to be reasonable to an old ally.
I mean, I think, speaking about being reasonable, the reasonable question to ask in that sense then is what would the implications be in those circumstances for the alliance relationship that we do have with the United States that confers on us certain obligations?
Well, it confers on us obligations which have never been called upon, and it confers on the United States obligations that an Australian government attempted to call on and was refused. I know 3 times in my political lifetime when America has chosen Indonesia over Australia. The first was during confrontation, and it was McEwen who asked the most perceptive question. There was a discussion between Barwick, McEwen, Menzies, and Governor Harriman, who I think was Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs at the time, but he was certainly out here as the leading American emissary. And at the end of the discussion, McEwen said, well, you know, you've said that ANZUS would apply if there's a direct invasion from Indonesia, and we accept that. But you know, Governor, that it's not going to be that way. The people we're fighting in Borneo are some of the best trained American Indonesian troops, and the top 300,000 troops were very good indeed. But Indonesia said they're unofficial, they're irregulars. I suppose the sort of thing that Mr. Putin's been saying about the Crimea. But we knew they weren't, and our army knew they weren't, and I was army minister at the time. And so McEwen said, if it's an infiltration that's very serious, what then would America do? And Harriman's reply was, well, Mr. McEwen, you've asked a most perceptive question, but I find that the time remaining for this discussion, it had already gone on 3 or 4 hours, in the time remaining for this discussion, it would not be possible to find words that would sufficiently accurate to give you a fair answer. Now, I suppose that's the politest no you could ever imagine. Barwick lost his job because he'd said publicly that our troops fighting in, now look, all the officials in the document say he didn't lose his job because of that, but I'm damn sure he did. He said our troops in Borneo were covered under ANZUS, and they weren't, and the Americans objected to it. Over West Irian, I'm probably older than most of you, so I can remember when you can't perhaps, we had wanted a genuine act of self-determination. Nobody else did. They wanted a phony act that would necessarily give West Irian to Indonesia. The Americans wouldn't support us, the British wouldn't support us, the Dutch wouldn't support us, the Portuguese wouldn't support us. Nobody was going to support us. And the government had dug itself into quite a hole by being more vehement that the people in West Irian should have a really genuine opportunity to say what they wanted. In the end, what happened was a farce, as we all know, and designed to end up. The Economist wrote in that time, about 1961 or 3, Australia deludes itself absolutely if they believe that America will ever choose Australia over Indonesia, no matter what damage it does to Australian interests, unless Indonesia is governed by an openly and blatantly communist country. And look, 300 million Indonesians, the largest and still moderate Islamic country in the world. Who's more important, that or 23 million Australians? Now, every Australian government is going to say, we have a special relationship. But I hardly know a country in the world that doesn't have a special relationship with the United States, including Britain. And what has America done that would help Britain? Well, you can remember Suez and the total humiliation of that in 1956. America does what America wants. I don't expect anything else. I don't blame them for it.
Mr. Fraser, didn't they actually help save Britain the Second World War?
Sorry, I think that you can...
Well, let me answer that.
Okay.
They left Britain fighting Nazi Germany, doing what it was doing to the Jews for 2.5 years. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and saved us, America declared war on Japan, but not on Germany. It was Germany who declared war on Britain. Now, how could a country that had any sense of honor or decency in this world leave Britain fighting alone against that kind of enemy? I just fail to understand.
You see, he hasn't lost his touch dealing with it. Go back into the fray. Malcolm, I want to ask
Gadsden did at the age of 84.
I want to ask you now about reaction to the book. How would you assess that reaction? What has it told you about the state of the debate about our place in the world? And have you had any reaction from members of the government, the Abbott government, to the book?
I've had a couple of reactions from America, a couple of commentaries from America, which were not all that bad, having regard to the fact that one of our dangerous allies was writing the commentary. Some of the reactions to the book in Australia and Hugh White's was the best by far, but he doesn't agree with my conclusion because he says we should persuade America to change her policy. Well, if I thought we could, I'd support Hugh absolutely. But I've seen enough of America in government and out to know that when they're making up their policy, they do it in their own confines. And consultation with an ally consists of persuading the ally that what they've done or are going to do is right and correct. And they're not going to change that because we say their policy in the Western Pacific. I mean, Hugh says they should share power with China. And that both sides should stop being assertive or provocative. And I think both have probably been equally provocative. But, you can't. And if you can't change America to change policy, with the very real danger of conflict between Japan and China, which he said could happen last year, but he was wrong in his timescale, but not necessarily wrong in substance. And with Obama's last statement in particular about nuclear guarantees for the Sendaku Daio Islands, I think the most dangerous course we can take is to refuse to recognize that the world has changed and that, in a sense, the only reason for ANZUS or for the relationship with the United States is because we have a relationship with the United States. I can't see a specific threat to Australia that Australia would not be able to handle on a regional basis. But the end point of Hugh's writings in this is that if there's a conflict between China and America, America may well not win. Now, if America, with a technological advantage over Vietnam, which is greater than her technological advantage over China today, with 600,000 troops on the ground, dropping more bombs on North Vietnam than America dropped in the whole of Europe during the Second World War, the second half of the Second World War, and on Korea, then they can't beat Vietnam. They can't beat China. Now, the price of defeat would be get rid of your military facilities in the Western Pacific. America would go back to America, disgruntled, disjointed, with a very bad blood nose. We don't go anywhere. We're left here as a defeated ally of a defeated superpower. And if you want to put Australia at risk, you pursue a course of action that will lead to that result.
I was going to leave a question about this present government's foreign policy performance until later in the context of discussion about Ukraine and Iraq, which I'm sure we'll have. But I thought at this stage it might be a bad idea for you to give your appraisal of how this government is performing in that foreign policy space.
I didn't like spying on the Indonesian president. I didn't like people saying, come on, it's Team Australia now, you can't criticise ASIO for doing so. Now, the security services have become enormously important, and therefore what they do can be more important. And very often security services do things, spy on people, simply because they can do it. Now, that's not a sufficient reason for doing it. You have to exercise your judgment. There are always risks when you're spying on somebody, especially on the president's mobile phone and his wife's mobile phone, because you're going to get found out. And the chance of learning something of interest, or you might learn something of interest but of no strategic importance on that sort of telephone, is very, very low indeed. So ASIO doing that sort of thing was really exercising extraordinarily bad judgment. And Australians and Australian politicians have a right to criticise that if they want to. And the government should have done what Obama did in relation to Germany, apologise and say it won't happen again, and that would have ended it very quickly. And that hasn't happened even now. Telling what a Chinese visitor just yesterday had a crack at us when he said that, you know, he knew China wasn't our best friend. And to say that Japan's our best friend when you know the bitterness between Japan and China. Japan has never apologized for atrocities committed in China. Knowledge of those atrocities is written out of Japanese school books, but it's well understood by Chinese school children from a pretty young age. And so you don't need any government action to stir up anti-Japanese feelings in relation to China. At the moment, the two countries are hardly talking to each other. And I don't know that we've handled the balance. I mean, Julie Bishop, said that we're going to stand up to China. Stand up to China with what? What for? It wasn't our fight, it wasn't our problem, it wasn't our issue. Had America asked her to say that? Maybe, I don't know. But I don't think you get enormous marks for the way Pacific policy has been handled. And coming back from the United States, the Prime Minister indicated that if the American wanted to double the size of the task force, well, clearly North Australia is large enough to find another home. So I suppose we give them Laverack Barracks as well as to Townsville, as well as Darwin. I think they've done well over the aircraft. The Europeans would regard Australia as too pushy and too upfront. The idea of putting Australian armed troops into the Ukraine was always an absurdity. The idea of providing humanitarian aid and humanitarian military aid and military advisors to the Ukraine was also a pretty fair absurdity. I'd like to know if the Chiefs of Armed Services or the Defence Committee, if it's ever consulted, had approved of that particular idea. We followed America into enough wars, Iraq on the basis of a lie, and if the truth be known, from looking in the hindsight, so far as I'm concerned, also Vietnam on the basis of a lie, because President Johnson had a different kind of advice from the CIA analysts to that which he was getting from Westmoreland and Cabot Lodge. you know, it's before committing forces into something like the new coalition in Iraq, I think you'd want to know that Arab states are going to be involved, that some of the Gulf states are going to be involved. The first George Bush had a coalition of 31 nations. He even had Jews and Arabs fighting on the same side, which was some achievement. And that was a genuine international coalition. Now, so far, President Obama has not been able to manage that kind of coalition by any means. There are 8 or 10 states, but mostly Western states, that have said they'll support the operation. But what's the end point? Are they going to attack ISIS in Syria also? It's only, what, a year ago that the Americans and the British were wanting to attack the rebels in ISIS, or no, support the rebels and attack Assad. Now, if you're attacking the rebels who've morphed into ISIS, I don't think there are too many good rebels left in Syria. You look as if you're supporting Assad, when up to last year everyone was saying what a terrible wretch he is, and very likely he is. But, you know, one of the great misreadings in the Middle East was to assume that the rebels fighting against a terrible regime were going to be better. And too often that assumption was made by people who should have known better, and who did not know anything like enough to make a proper judgment about the rebel forces, whether it was in Libya, Tunisia, or wherever.
Maybe I should mention I spent 10 years of my career in the Middle East, and I think, as a rule of thumb, there are no good guys per se. There are just some that are less bad than others. Malcolm, we'll come back to Iraq, but I wanted to ask you about your chapter on Bert Ebbett. I was glad to see you devoted a whole chapter to Ebbett. A short one, but I think it had some point, you know, in terms of your overall thesis. I mean, he was, in my view, the outstanding foreign minister in our history. If you wanted to rank them, and I'd be interested to hear your view on this, you might rank them Ebbett, Spender, Casey, Hasluck, or Evans, Hasluck, but you may have a different order. But maybe you can just amplify your views about Ebbett and his significance today.
Unfortunately, Australia's memory of Ebbett is forever tarnished by his later political years, when he did exhibit some very significant errors of judgment. But as foreign minister, he built up an effective foreign affairs department, which later on did some good things, especially in Indonesia and especially in Malaya, during the early troubles, the communist insurrection, and in Indonesia during confrontation. Mikshan always had access. I think we're very distinguished High Commission ambassadors sitting in the room not far from here. And that was all partly, I don't know if Bruce was part of the product of whatever it did, but they did build up an effective department. But more important than that, as leader of small countries, as a defender of middle powers, he was by far the most effective spokesman in relation to the formation of the United Nations. And at the end of his time there, Ebbett was given a standing ovation, which I don't think anyone else has ever had over the standing ovation, which included the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. There was an editorial in the New York Times, totally different from the sort of reports we're getting in the New York Times today about asylum seekers and other people, and the way we're breaking Australian and international law. And the New York Times praised Ebbett to the skies as an example of really what a foreign minister and diplomat ought to be, fighting for the rights of small and middle-ranking nations, fighting for an international organization that would be effective, that would work, that would be practical, but never pushing the argument so hard that he prevented agreement being reached. And you know, anyone interested in the Everett history, either buy the book and read what the New York Times said on that, or go to the New York Times archive and look up the editorial itself. And I can't really go beyond that editorial. I think it was totally justified, and Australia had started off very well. He took a more constructive role, still a pretty cautious one in relation to the independence of Indonesia, but certainly a more constructive role than the Liberal Party took at the same time.
I won't ask you to rank your top 5 unless you'd like to.
Well, I think Percy Spender was a good foreign minister. I think Dick Casey was a good foreign minister. And you mightn't think it, but you know, these people tramped up and down countries throughout Asia and started to earn Australia respect in the post-war years. And you know, a lot of prime ministers have said they wanted to be the first to take Australia into Asia or develop a relationship. But in effect, it has been a continuum ever since the end of the Second World War. I think every government has worked at improving the relationship. Perhaps I might exempt the last 20 years.
Well, you didn't serve as foreign minister, your own foreign minister. This brings us to
my own foreign minister was good. And no, Andrew was a really good foreign minister.
Maybe we'll put him at number 6. This brings us to the Cold War and the countdown to Vietnam, and I should say that I'm of that generation. What struck me about those chapters, and that chapter particularly now, was how candid you were about your own evolution and your own thinking. About the conflict, how you were wrong, actually, how you misread the situation. I just wonder if you could tell us how that has influenced your thinking as far as how you perceive things today. What sort of influence did that experience have on you? As a young minister, of course, minister for the army, and later in other roles in government.
Well, I would have started to change as army minister, although you mightn't have really sensed that in any way. Because during the Cold War, and as Prime Minister, I believe, for example, over Afghanistan, that the West should show a concerted and unified position in relation to the Soviet Union. And that is really the only reason we were supported. Helmut Schmidt had an agreement with Jimmy Carter that America would not propose a boycott of the Olympic Games. 24 hours later, Helmut Schmidt saw Jimmy Carter on television announcing a boycott of the Olympic Games. And that embarrassed him, it embarrassed me and others. Schmidt was able to persuade his Olympic Committee to comply. Well, you know what happened here. It was one of the most terrible and divisive bits of policy done in the name of Western solidarity. As Army Minister, we were learning things from the Army that we were not being told from official sources. I tried to get Fairhall to go to Washington and say, look, we needed somebody in the councils, war councils, when Vietnam was being discussed, so we could have some input into the strategy and get some warning of what America is going to do next. Well, Alan Fairhall was probably more realistic than me, and he knew the Americans wouldn't agree to it, so he didn't bother to go to Washington. It's a long story, but I'll make it very short. Over the F-111 as Defence Minister, I learned that you never buy brownie points with a major power. It doesn't matter what you've done, what wars you've supported them in. Business is business, and to hell with all the rest. And I got saved by the Senate committee on the F-111, which was sitting, the ambassador told me they were going to meet next Monday. So I said, well, get on to them and see if they want Australian Air Marshal, Defence Minister, Secretary of Defence out at Tang, but more particularly half a dozen Australian Air Force scientists who've been at Fort Worth for the last 3 or 4 years, if we want all of us to come and tell the Senate exactly what we know about this aircraft. And the danger was that America were going to take an aircraft that would be no use to us because they were going to put nukes in it and they were going to have in-flight refueling. We didn't then have either of those things, and we didn't want to have the expensive in-flight refueling. So we could have been left with a plane that wouldn't even get to Jakarta with an overnight bag in it. Anyway, when Mill Laird heard of this, and I told him on the phone, he said, "Malcolm, where are you? That's a very unfriendly act. Very unfriendly act. Why have you done it?" I said, "Well, we've paid you $130 million and you might be trying to force us to buy a plane that won't be any use." I was trying to renegotiate the contract to get some performance guarantees built into it. And he said, "Where are you?" "The Australian Embassy." "Could you give me 10 minutes if I come around there now, right now?" So about 7 minutes later, sirens screaming, motorbike outriders, Secretary of Defence arrived from the Pentagon, coming and visiting a lowly Australian Defence Minister. That was a change. And anyway, he said, "Martin, well, come on, we've got to kick out the generals and do a deal. Tell me what you want." "Mel, I've been telling you for 2 damn weeks. "I know that, but for the first time now, I'm listening." And I showed him a bit of paper that Col Hanna had prepared, an ordinary bit of school paper, and I've tried to find this. I think I'll have given it to Col Hanna, and it might be with his personal effects somewhere. And he had 10 points on it. And I showed this to Laird, and he said, "That's all eminently reasonable. If I was you, I'd be demanding all of this too." So I said, "Well, sign it." And I signed it. He said, "Now you'll pull your people out of that Senate inquiry." I said, "No, I won't. This isn't a legal document, and at the moment I did it, you could repudiate it. But if it's an illegal document, before the close of business before lunchtime on Sunday, I won't go along to the Senate committee." We had the legal document to the satisfaction of our Air Force and lawyers on the Saturday, which must have been the fastest bit of legal crafting that had ever happened in Washington. Now, that was not due to my negotiating skills. It was simply the act of good fortune, conjunction of time and circumstance. And we got an aircraft that has been a very good one for Australia over a long period of years. But they couldn't have cared 2 hoots in hell if we'd been forced to take an aircraft that was totally useless for us. And with the performance guarantees, if they weren't able to live up to that, we could have sued them for the money we'd already spent, which was about $130 million. So that was, I suppose, teaching me something about American motivation. When I learned, long after, I read McNamara's book about In Retrospect, and then I read CIA analysis, semi-official analysis of the book. Where's it accurate, where's it inaccurate, where's it complete, where's it not? But more importantly, why were the CIA analyst views of Vietnam so totally different from Westmoreland and Cabot Lodge? Now, Johnson was listening to Westmoreland and ignoring the CIA reports. We never had those CIA reports. Harold Holt would never have committed 3 battalions to Vietnam if he'd seen them. He hated conscription. He believed it was necessary in the circumstances of the times. But I know that personally, that particular contest and the issues affected him deeply. Johnson misled Fulbright, who afterwards said that he'd been totally misled over the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And he had, Fulbright had guided the Warpath resolution through the Senate for Johnson. Now, if an American president's prepared to do that to his own Senate, he's certainly prepared to do it for an Australia. And then we have the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, which was a total and absolute absurdity from day one. And the only reason that decent George Bush, who I had a letter from about a week ago, did not go and get rid of Saddam Hussein, he knew it would unleash sectarian forces that would have the capacity to spread across the Middle East. And he did not know how to replace it. He knew that a benign democracy would not arise. He knew the neoconservatives, who hadn't really emerged as a political force, but if they had voiced their views, he would have regarded it as a total and absolute nonsense. And so that, the relief of Kuwait is, I think, the only Western success you can point to in the whole of the Middle East in the time since that first Gulf War. So, you know, America is capable of making extraordinary mistakes. And if they haven't got a diplomatic solution to a problem, they turn to the use of military power. And they haven't learned that you can't achieve diplomatic political ends by the use of overwhelming military power. And then you come to what I ended up by saying when I was standing up there. We have given this power the capacity to take us to war because of changed circumstances in the Pacific. And I think that's a total stupidity on our part.
Lawrence tells me we've just got a couple more minutes, Malcolm. I was going to ask you about the nub of your thesis, but I think it will come up in relation to Pine Gap and the strategic independence, which you talk about at length in the book. So, from a journalist standpoint, I guess we'd like to hear what your view is about how this government should handle requests for assistance in Iraq and possibly in Syria. To what extent should it respond to those requests?
It would have to. It would have to be convinced that there's an end plan, a strategic approach that makes sense. Now, the only sign of a strategic approach that makes sense is that Obama's trying to put together a coalition of nations, trying to get Middle East states involved on the ground in a fight that is their fight more than anyone else's. But you know, the dilemma in Syria. You go to war in Syria now, are you going to fight Assad and the rebels and ISIL? Or just ISIL and strengthen Assad? I mean, that just shows the lack of foresight, the absurdity of the way Western policy has been conducted over the last year or two. So I can't give you any clear-cut answer in relation to that, except I would insist on clearly achievable objectives, achievable in our judgment, and in the judgment of our Defence Committee and military and foreign affairs people, before you embark on another Iraq venture.
Thank you very much. I have to say that you're marginally more benign than you were back in 1975. I was absolutely terrified of you. Thanks very much.
You shouldn't have been.
But thanks very much for responding to these questions. There's going to be many more, and Lawrence will deal with them.